In the heart of Appalachia, there was a city that lived a double life. By day, it was Wheeling, West Virginia, a town of steel, smoke, and hard-working men. But when the sun bled out behind the mountains, it became something else entirely. A place whispered about in neighboring states, a place that earned the sinister nickname Little Chicago. How could a city in the middle of conservative America become a gangster's paradise, a capital of vice where the law was just a suggestion? The official records talk about crime, but the mountains remember a different story. The tragedy of a city that sold its soul for a few decades of neon lights and easy money. Wheeling wasn't born a monster. For generations, it was a city built on sweat and steel, nestled in a bend of the mighty Ohio River. Its lifeblood was the clanging of the mills and the rumble of the coal cars. The air was thick with the smell of industry, and the brick buildings were permanently stained with a film of soot. This was the Rust Belt in its prime, a tough, proud place where a man's worth was measured by the calluses on his hands. It was a world of simple, hard truths. You worked, you provided for your family, and you found your rest on Sunday. The people of Wheeling were the heart of this world. They were steel workers, miners, and factory hands who came home each night with their faces smudged with grime and their bodies aching. They were men and women who understood the grim reality of life in the mountains. Their dreams weren't grand. They dreamed of a steady paycheck, a hot meal on the table, and maybe a little something extra on a Saturday night to forget the toil of the week. This city was their home, their legacy, a place they had built with their own two hands. Into this world of grit and labor stepped a man named William Lias, known to everyone as Big Bill. He wasn't a gangster in a pinstripe suit who rolled in from New York or Chicago. He was the son of Greek immigrants, a local boy who understood the city's hunger. He had a disarming smile and a way of speaking that made you feel like he was your oldest friend. He started small, running whiskey during Prohibition, but he wasn't just a bootlegger. He was a visionary of vice. Lias saw the exhaustion in the eyes of the workers, and he offered them an escape. He built churches and sponsored little league teams, presenting himself as a pillar of the community, a generous benefactor. People loved him. He gave them jobs when the mills were slow and entertainment when their lives felt bleak. He was one of them, they thought, just a little smarter, a little luckier. They didn't see the ice behind his eyes or the cold calculation in his every move. But a shadow was beginning to stretch over Wheeling, long before it was ever called Little Chicago. It started with a friendly game of cards in the back of a tavern, a slot machine quietly installed in the corner of a diner. It was the friendly cop who was told to look the other way. The small envelope of cash slipped into a politician's hand. Each small compromise was another brick in the foundation of a corrupt empire. The city, so desperate for a taste of prosperity, didn't realize it was making a deal with the devil. They were a community on the brink, about to lose everything they thought they were, all for the illusion of a good time. It wasn't a single gunshot that marked the point of no return for Wheeling. It was a sound, the constant mechanical grinding and clatter of hundreds, then thousands of slot machines. Big Bill Lias didn't conquer the city with an army of thugs. He seduced it with an army of one-armed bandits. They appeared like a quiet invasion, first in the back rooms of his clubs, then in bars, restaurants, and eventually even corner drugstores. Each machine was a tiny, glittering promise of fortune, and a spigot for a river of untaxed silver that flowed directly into his empire. At first, the city's honest lawmen tried to fight back. They would raid an establishment, confiscate a few machines, and make an arrest, feeling they'd done their duty. But it was a fool's errand. The arrested man would be out on bail within an hour, the case mysteriously dismissed by a compliant judge. The next day, 2 new machines would appear in the same spot. It was a demoralizing, soul-crushing charade. This is where the real poison took hold. Lias understood that you didn't need to own every man with a gun if you owned the men with the gavels and the badges. The system of corruption wasn't a secret. It was an institution. Police officers began receiving weekly envelopes stuffed with cash, a bonus for simply looking the other way. It wasn't presented as a dirty bribe, but as a practical arrangement, a way to ensure the city ran smoothly. For a cop with a family to feed on a meager salary, the choice was brutal. Uphold a law that no one else respected, or accept the cash and provide. One by one, the city's guardians laid down their arms. The conflict shifted from the streets to the quiet, desperate struggle within the hearts of those few who refused to bend. A councilman who spoke out against the gambling racket would find his business suddenly failing inspections. A reporter who dug too deep might get a quiet visit, a friendly warning that his curiosity was unhealthy. The violence wasn't always loud. It was often the silent, chilling threat of ruin. The first drops of blood weren't shed on the pavement. They were the slow bleeding of a city's integrity, the death of its hope that the law was still the law. Wheeling had crossed a threshold, and everyone knew it. The city no longer belonged to its people. It belonged to Big Bill Lias. The slaughter in Little Chicago wasn't a single night of gunfire. It was a slow, methodical strangulation of a city's soul, carried out over decades in smoke-filled backrooms and on dimly lit streets. It was the steelworker who, after a brutal week in the mill, came to Wheeling looking for a little fun. He'd put a few coins in one of Big Bill's machines, mesmerized by the spinning reels. That small thrill became a weekly ritual, then an obsession. The children's frozen terror wasn't from seeing a monster, but from watching their father walk through the door with empty pockets and hollow eyes, his week's pay sacrificed to the one-armed bandit. His family didn't die in a hail of bullets. They starved slowly, their future devoured $1 silver at a time. This was Lias's genius. His violence was often invisible. But for those who couldn't be bought or intimidated, a more permanent solution was whispered about. The Ohio River, the city's lifeblood, became its graveyard. No one ever admitted to seeing a body thrown from the Wheeling suspension bridge, but the stories were there, dark and cold as the river itself. A man who couldn't pay his debts would simply vanish. The rumor was he'd gone for a swim in cement shoes. Fishermen downstream would sometimes cut their lines in a panic, having snagged something that felt unnervingly human, and they learned to never, ever talk about it. The river kept its secrets. As time went on, the violence grew bolder. After Lias, a new figure rose to prominence. Paul No Legs Hankish, a man who ruled his own syndicate from a wheelchair with a cold, terrifying fury. The quiet threats of Big Bill's era were replaced by open warfare. One night, the calm was ripped apart by a deafening explosion that rattled windows for miles. Where a car had been parked on a residential street, there was now only a mangled, smoking crater of twisted metal. The blast didn't just kill a man, it served as a public execution, a message written in fire and shrapnel. The true heart of darkness in Wheeling was this normalization of dread, the silence of the good people who were too scared to speak, the casual acceptance that some men were above the law and that a human life was worth less than a gambling debt. The city hadn't been conquered by an outside force. It had been eaten alive from the inside, one compromised soul, one broken family, and one silent splash in the river at a time. For decades, the corruption in Wheeling was a ghost at the feast, a secret everyone knew but no one dared to name aloud. But eventually, the whispers from those dark Appalachian hills grew loud enough to reach Washington. A U.S. senator from Tennessee named Estes Kefauver had declared a crusade against organized crime, and his traveling committee was cutting a swath across the nation. When they set their sights on West Virginia, Little Chicago was suddenly blinded by a spotlight it could not control. The party was over. The end didn't come with a shootout. It came with the quiet, methodical arrival of men in dark suits who carried briefcases instead of shotguns. They were agents from the FBI and, more importantly, the Internal Revenue Service. They were a quiet army of accountants and taxmen who were immune to Big Bill's charm and his envelopes of cash. They weren't interested in the rumors of bodies in the river. They were interested in the river of money that flowed from the slot machines, a river that had never once touched the ledger books of the US Treasury. The reaction in the city was a quiet, nervous panic. The web of corruption that had felt so strong began to fray. Police officers who had been on the take for years suddenly grew fearful, their weekly payoffs now feeling like anchors that could drag them to the bottom. Politicians who had dined at Lias's table now couldn't remember his name. For the first time in a generation, a force had arrived in Wheeling that Big Bill could not buy, control, or intimidate. The fear that had held the city in his grip was now turned against his own people. Then came the raids. But these were not the staged, theatrical raids of the local police. Federal agents moved with cold efficiency. They didn't just seize a few slot machines, they swept through the city like a cleansing fire. In a single day, thousands of one-armed bandits were confiscated. They were dragged out of the bars and clubs, piled onto trucks, and taken to be destroyed. The signature sound of Little Chicago, that constant, hopeful, greedy grinding of the machines, was replaced by the sound of smashing glass and splintering wood as they were broken apart with sledgehammers. A new kind of silence fell over Wheeling. The neon lights of the gambling dens and backroom casinos flickered and went dark, one by one. The weekend crowds from Ohio and Pennsylvania stopped coming. The flow of easy money that had been the city's lifeblood and its poison simply ceased. What was left was a city in a state of shock, holding its breath. The king was cornered, his empire was in ruins, and the ashes of his fallen kingdom were still settling in the quiet, empty streets. The federal courthouse in Wheeling wasn't one of Big Bill's smoky backrooms. It was a place of cold marble, polished wood, and unwavering fluorescent lights, a world where his charisma and cash held no power. His trial was the greatest show the city had ever seen. The courtroom was packed every day with a strange mix of his loyalists, his victims, and the morbidly curious, all wanting to see if the king would finally fall. Armed federal marshals stood guard, their presence a stark reminder that the old rules no longer applied. For the first time, justice in Wheeling would be decided not by a backroom deal, but by a jury of 12. In the defendant's chair sat William Lias, and he looked like a man out of time. The confident, charming benefactor was gone. In his place was an aging man in an ill-fitting suit, looking confused and diminished under the weight of federal authority. He would scan the faces in the crowd, perhaps searching for the familiar fear and respect he once commanded. But he found only strangers and the cold, impartial gaze of the law. This wasn't his world. He was a mountain lion dragged from his territory and put in a cage, surrounded by hunters who spoke a language he didn't understand. The prosecution's case was a masterpiece of methodical destruction. They didn't call witnesses to speak of rumored murders or broken legs. They didn't speak of the fear that had paralyzed the city for a generation. Instead, they brought in accountants. They presented ledgers, bank statements, and sworn testimony from Lias's own bookkeepers. One by one, former associates and lieutenants, men who had gotten rich under his protection, took the stand to save themselves, their testimony a cascade of betrayals that buried their old boss under a mountain of evidence. The weapon that finally brought down the king of Little Chicago wasn't a smoking gun, it was a fountain pen. The charge was the same one that had felled Al Capone, tax evasion. The government proved with painstaking detail that millions of dollars from thousands of slot machines had simply vanished, never to be seen by the taxman. It was a simple, brutal, and undeniable truth. While the newspapers screamed about racketeering and the whispers on the street told of bodies in the river, the case itself was as dry as dust. It was a cold, mathematical execution. When the jury returned, the verdict was a formality. Guilty. William Big Bill Lias, the man who had owned a city, who had built an empire on vice and fear, was sentenced to years in federal prison. The law of men had finally won. But as he was led from the courtroom, a free man no more, a question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Was this justice? The man who corrupted a generation of public officials and broke countless families on the altar of gambling was going to prison for a bookkeeping crime. The system had punished him, yes, but it felt like it had punished him for the wrong reasons. The city was free of its king, but the real sins of Little Chicago seemed to have been left unjudged, washed away like so many other dark secrets in the Ohio River. Big Bill Lias did eventually get out of prison. He returned to Wheeling, but the city he came back to was no longer his kingdom. He was a ghost from a bygone era, his power broken, his name now just a story whispered by old-timers. The man who had once been the uncrowned king of a city died not in a hail of gunfire, but quietly, his empire already turned to dust. The vacuum he left behind was filled for a time by more vicious predators like No Legs Hankish, whose reign was one of bombs and fear, but that too eventually crumbled under the relentless pressure of federal law enforcement. If you drive through Wheeling today, you can still visit the heart of Big Bill's old empire, Wheeling Downs. It's a modern racetrack and casino now, clean, bright, and perfectly legal. The clatter of slot machines is back, but now every dollar is counted and taxed. It stands as a sanitized monument to a dark past, a place where families can go for an afternoon of fun, with no idea of the illegal betting syndicates and hidden currents of cash that once defined its very existence. It's the ghost of what it once was, tamed and put on display. Walk the older streets of downtown, past the brick facades that have stood for a century, and you can almost feel the echoes. That building there, now a law office, might have been the 19th hole, where deals were made in clouds of cigar smoke. That empty storefront could have been a club where a politician and a gangster shook hands. The neon signs are gone, the secret tunnels are sealed or forgotten, and the Ohio River flows on, carrying its secrets silently to the sea. Most people who live in Wheeling now have only a vague sense of this history. Little Chicago is a nickname, a local legend. But the deepest scars left by that era aren't in the brick and mortar. They are in the city's soul. It's an ingrained distrust of authority, a cynical belief that every system can be bought. It's in the stories passed down from grandfathers who remember the open secret of the city's double life. The official records are filed away in dusty archives, but in Appalachia, the true history is the one that lives in the memory of the people. The mountains saw it all, and the mountains never forget. So we come back to the question that hung in the smoky air at the start of our story. How did a hard-working Appalachian city become a gangster's paradise? The answer is as simple as it is tragic. Little Chicago wasn't built by force. It was built on a quiet, desperate bargain. Big Bill Lias didn't conquer Wheeling. He seduced it. He offered a city, weary from the toil of the mills and the mines, an escape. He offered them the illusion of prosperity, the thrill of the jackpot, and all he asked for in return was their silence and their soul. This is more than just a crime story. It is a cautionary tale, a lesson etched into the very hills of West Virginia. It's a story about the danger of looking the other way, of accepting small compromises until there is nothing left of your integrity to compromise. The tragedy of Wheeling wasn't just that a criminal empire rose in its streets, but that so many good people stood by and let it happen, convinced that the easy money was worth the moral rot that came with it. It is a timeless story of how a community, desperate for a better life, can make a deal with the devil, never realizing the price is always far higher than they can imagine. The steel mills have cooled, and the bright neon signs are dark. But the ghost of Little Chicago still haunts these hills, a cold lesson written in the heart of Appalachia. Its legacy is a reminder that the most dangerous monsters are not always the ones who break down your door, but the ones you willingly invite inside.